Good evening, afternoon, and morning, whenever it happens to be. I'm living in my own time zone, so it's good evening to you. We are continuing with our wonderful exploration of divine friendship, and I'm quite surprised to see how far we are into the book. Anyway, but it's very, very good, and we're in the section called Insights and Commentary, and what we have right now is we have education, which we probably will not finish tonight. Or if we finish, we won't finish more than that, because then after that we go into astrology. Wish me luck. Okay, let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, Divine Friend, Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence. Inspire us with your wisdom. Help us to be changed by your presence. That we may live in this world. With the freedom and joy. That God intended for us. Om. Peace. Amen. Going to have a couple of chants. I bet you deduced that from the man sitting next to me and the harmonium he's holding. So let's have a couple of chants and then a little bit of meditation.
Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light. Come out of the darkness, Mother, bathe me in thy light. 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 Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Divine mother, 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 my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Divine mother, 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 my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Divine mother, 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 my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Divine mother, 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 my divine mother.
Om, peace. Amen. Okay, my friends, let's do it. We are in the middle of this letter about education for life, and it was written in August of 2000. And Swami received an inquiry from an academic on the East Coast, a woman, who also was working under the auspices of a priest, a Catholic priest. I mean, I know the woman and I know the circumstance, but she was an academic studying various forms of education. She read Swami's book, Education for Life, and felt like it was the most comprehensive, sensible, best educational system that she'd come across. Swami was just delighted that somebody who was a specialist in that field, but outside of the field of Ananda or self-realization, as you know, as our group, an objective outsider researching the subject would be so enamored of his work. And she sent him various questions, and this letter is in answer, and I'd started. The letter is about 4 pages in the book, and I read through the first page. So, what he's saying, the education needs I see today are, Swami writes, and I'm just summarizing what I said last time. First point, modern schooling breeds atheism. 2, children need to be taught values. And the second half of that children need to be taught values. I'm going to reread it because there's 2 paragraphs and I want to go on. But if moral values are left on a level of social or personal convenience, they are not values. They are merely schemes for self-betterment. The greatest defect in modern education is the modern dogma, that's all it is, that spirituality must necessarily be considered sectarian, a matter of beliefs, and therefore not scientific and not a proper subject for education. Now that I read last week. Now Swami says, the human race has been around a long time, however, and has learned by experience that certain kinds of behavior and certain attitudes work, and also that certain others don't work. They work in the sense that they provide what everyone wants: happiness, fulfillment, and expansion of understanding, inner peace, and success in one's undertaking. Other kinds of behaviors and other attitudes are negative, basically because they produce the opposite result, not always quickly, but definitely eventually in time. So the great objection has always been that people don't think we should teach a particular religion. And Swami's trying to say, and he also uses the word, people say that values are not scientific. But Swami's saying here, and it's just like, Swami's entire Education for Life book is common sense. It's not radical, it's not exaggerated, it's just simple common sense. And he says, we know from experience that certain attitudes bring positive results and certain attitudes don't. And why we have persuaded ourselves that we can't just say that is just part of the hypnosis that we're involved in. We have here in the Palo Alto community where I live, we have a school that we started about 30 years ago that runs from kindergarten through 8th grade, and then in the last 5 years, we've added the high school grades. The high school grades we're still developing. The K through 8 school, we have 30 years of experience. The first 7 years of the lower school, I acted as admissions director. I have had no formal training in educating children. I never worked in that field, although I probably expected that that's the field I would have gone into. I worked with children all through from early teenage all the way into till I was about 20. So I always had an affinity for children. But it was, I did creative dramatics, I was a camp counselor, I was that sort of thing. But I understood it just from past lives, I think. And when I was talking to parents about our school, I would say, what we do is just obvious. I said, we are interested in the entire well-being of the child. we don't have this arbitrary division, that we can do this and we can't do that. I said the way we treat children in our school is the way parents treat their children. Parents would never say that I will work with this area of the child but not this area. The whole person is the responsibility of the parent. And as teachers, as educators in the living wisdom schools, which is what they're named, the How to Live educational system, we are concerned with the whole well-being of the person that we're asked to educate. And part of that is, if you are selfish, if you are petulant, if you are mean-spirited, if you are insecure, if you're angry all the time, these are attitudes that don't work. So it's not going to help us to make you really expert at grammar and superb at math if we don't deal with the fact that you're emotionally struggling in all these different ways, or that you're completely distorted in your development and you're totally expert in this area and socially and with other people you're completely paralyzed, or that you're in a state of depression all the time because of the meaninglessness of life. No parent would be indifferent to that. Why are teachers prohibited from working with children on those areas? Why is it that we can't just put across what we common sense know to be true? So this is Swami's point of view, and I heartily agree with it. The third point Swami makes in this letter: spirituality needs to be separated from mere beliefs, and again, founded on people's experience of what actually works. In this sense, spirituality should be taught not dogmatically, but scientifically, which is to say, experientially. Swami's asking questions that she asked here. So she obviously asked him a question about spirituality. Scientifically means proven by experiment. And of course, it's not that easy to conduct experiments on human beings, but an experiment gives you an experience of what you're asserting might be true theoretically. You conduct an experiment, and then you have experience that's going to tell you. So he says spirituality must be taught not as a series of beliefs. This is what we believe, and if you're going to be a follower of this, whatever it is, this is what you believe. Spirituality is experiential. What are your goals in life? Everyone wants to be happy. Everyone wants to escape suffering. Spirituality is the science of happiness. It's as simple as that. So it needs to be taught experientially. Education, point number 4. Education needs to be geared not only toward helping children to become successful in their work once they grow up, but above all to become successful human beings. And again, this is one of the common sense realities. It's not just a question of how much money you can earn. It's who you are in yourself. What are your values? Well, for many good reasons, but not the least of which is what will determine your happiness. And success in this respect means, again, that which gives people what they really want in life: happiness and other qualities that I've mentioned. I mean, why do people want money? Because they think it's going to lessen the pain and increase the happiness. Why do people want status, success? Because they think it's going to lessen the pain and increase happiness. So one can work much more directly on the attitudes and the values that inherently create happiness, instead of having it be one removed and hope that it works. The belief, number 5, the belief that understanding is only of the mind, not of the heart, needs to be balanced by a realization that heartfelt understanding is not a matter of emotion, but of intuition. Now, here's where the idea of feeling has been pushed to the background when people think of feeling only as emotion. Emotion being a temporary mood that captures you, rather than feeling is the quality of awareness that is expansively emanates from the heart and calm feeling produces intuition. Now, nowadays, where innovation and creativity is so much studied, the value of intuition the concept of intuition, of intuitive understanding, has been raised up in importance. And nowadays, especially when innovation happens so fast that mere information will not ensure any kind of capacity to actually excel. What you need to be is flexible, creative, intuitive, able to respond to what's happening. By the time people graduate, one person's new invention can neutralize everything they've learned in their whole field of study, whatever it might be. I was very interested. I mean, now, those of you who are younger than I won't even understand this concept, but I lived through this cycle when the first video games started appearing. And people looked at a screen and moved an object, moved a lever or a mouse or whatever it was. You looked at a screen, you moved something with your hand, with your eyes on the screen, and with your eyes and hands, you created whatever you were going to create. You played a game, you responded quickly. I don't know how things are done now, but that's what I remember. Then a very interesting thing happened in medicine. Whereas surgeons had always looked down at their hands and done their work on the human body, that we've started this microsurgery, and we started sending the little robot in. And so the surgeon had to look at a screen and do very, very fine activities with his hand, moving a lever, looking at the screen. And it was very interesting because young surgeons who had grown up on video games, just that was an automatic characteristic in them. And older surgeons who had been sometimes at the top of their field suddenly found themselves having to learn an entirely new body-brain relationship because everything had innovated and changed. I mean, that's just one example. There's just countless examples where by the time you graduate, everything you learn is completely obsolete. And so what you need to have is a different kind of skill set, which allows you to move and to adapt and above all to be intuitive. And that's what he says. Intuition strikes much closer to truth than intellectual analysis ever can. And love can understand far more, even in scientific fields, than most people are willing to believe. They think understanding comes by definition. It doesn't. It comes by experience. There's a wonderful story told about the scientist and saint who was George Washington Carver, who was born into slavery, but slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation came when he was still a baby. So he was right on that cusp of transition, born into the South, where black people had been enslaved and then black people were free. And he was in many ways a saint to the black people at that time, because what he was a saint, and he was a saint sent to help in that transition, because all of these enslaved people, many had been enslaved for generations, they did not know how to take initiative and make their own lives work. They had been utterly dependent. Among the many, many, devastating, brutal consequences of slavery is that it inhibits your free will and inhibits your initiative and it inhibits your independence. I don't just mean physically, but even of your mind. So George Washington Carver devoted himself at Tuskegee University, with another name that I always have trouble remembering, but there were two men who really worked together. And he developed many, many, many agricultural innovations, how to grow things, what to grow, created products and therefore markets for many things. Above all, he found hundreds and perhaps even thousands of uses for the peanut. And because the peanut grew very well It did not deplete the soil like cotton did. It was easy to grow and it grew in abundance, but the market for it was limited because at that time it was only used to feed animals. So he devoted himself scientifically to creating all these practical uses, which then created an economy for these farmers. So, but he was himself a saint, and every morning at 4 a.m. he would get up and he would go out into the woods and he would talk to God for a couple of hours, and God would tell him what to do with his day. So there's two things that are really wonderful that he said. One of them is, if you love anything enough, it will talk to you. And he said all of his innovations came because he loved the plants or whatever it was he was working with. He loved it, and then it talked to him. The peanut told him, what it could do. Now, another charming story about him is he related this story about one of his early morning conversations with God. He said to God, Lord, why did you make creation? And God answered him and said, George, that's a mighty big question for a person like you. So George then said, Lord, why did you make me? And God said, George, that's a little better, but that's still a mighty big question for a person like you. So George said, Lord, why did you make the peanut? And God said, now there's a question that I can answer. But he was talking about intuition. Intuition is much closer to truth. Understanding comes from the feeling we have about it. And the greatest scientists all talk about the feeling they have about what they're doing, the love that they have for what they're doing, and the intuitive way that answers come to them. If you love anything enough, it will talk to you. So, point number 6. Music should be, as Plato taught, an important part of every child's education, for only through music can the child get the point of any teaching, of better ways of living, thinking, and being, by feeling their reality instead of being merely able to define them. That's very interesting, isn't it? Swamiji put it tremendous. What he says about music is this. Swami said, music not only reflects states of consciousness, it creates them. So great attention must be given to the kind of music children are exposed to. Nowadays, we don't seem to have an understanding of childhood all that much. And so we expose children to extremely adult things. We dress children like tiny adults. If you look back, decades ago even, there used to be such a thing as children's clothes. And they were not just smaller versions of adult clothes. They were really sort of innocent-looking clothes. Nowadays, and I respond especially to the way little girls are dressed. I mean, we take little girls who are before puberty, and we put them in little costumes that are like sexy costumes, except they don't have those bodies, but they're expected to sort of see themselves in that light. And it's exceedingly unfortunate. And we teach them to dance in sensual ways, and we put on sensual music for 6 and 7 years old, and we think it's so cute when they dance that way. But it just diminishes their the period of their childlike innocence, and is not wholesome for society. Because music not only reflects consciousness, it creates it. Swami himself ended up writing like 400 pieces of music because we needed music that expressed the right consciousness. Now there's many charming children's songs, but one should really think about this and really, because children absorb so deeply. It's very interesting, Swami's instruction for us with education with children. First of all, in terms of music, he said, always be very conscious. But he said, don't ever take advantage of children and compel them to do things merely because adults find them cute. He said, "What you should never compel a child to do something that will be embarrassing to them later." He said, "Respect their dignity. They're full, conscious human beings. You can do things that are charming, that are lighthearted, that are playful, but not that are really mocking." And he said, in everything that the children learn, it's appropriate level for children, but there should be values expressed that the children can enjoy for the rest of their lives. And it's very interesting. Swami wrote, again, sometimes he would do things like seminally. He's written a dozen or two of children's songs that are very lighthearted and childlike, but we also enjoy them. One of them, "Move all you mountains that stand in my way, nothing can stop my progress." And you have these very affirmative arm motions with it. And you know, it's just like, and children really enjoy it and really get behind it, but they're also at the same time, they're absorbing a very important lesson through melody and through poetry and through the physical actions of their body. Like, why waste those opportunities merely just passing the time on trivia? It's not that we need to be over serious all the time, but the children are absorbing a consciousness. What kind of consciousness do we want them to have? And Swami takes this very seriously. Now, moving on, we've answered those questions. Oh, no, excuse me. These were actually 6 points that Swami himself asserted the education needs I see today are, and then later in the letters when the questions come. So Swami says, "Well, I've tossed off the above ideas quickly, though of course I've thought and written about them for many years, so I don't mean to say they've come simply off the top of my head. But if I were to think longer in the present context, I'd probably come up with several other basic needs in education today. And indeed, I think I've covered them fairly well in my book, which you've read, Education for Life." So the 6 points that Swami says: modern schooling breeds atheism, and that's not good. Children need to be taught values. Spirituality has to be separated from mere beliefs and should be based on experience. Understanding is not only of the mind, it's also of the heart. And music is central to education. As I said, I'm not familiar with other methods of education similar to what I've presented. The need is there, however, so it would not surprise me if others have tuned into that need, because she told him that education for life was not actually an original phrase, that there were several other systems throughout history that had also been called education for life. Swami said, well, that's not at all surprising, because it's too obvious a statement for him to have been the first one to think about it. But also, Swami says he never studied education, and I think he explains this later. It just came out of his intuition, out of his understanding of what was needed. He himself went to quite a few different schools in different countries. So he felt he'd been the human guinea pig for a lot of what he presented. I come now to the part in all this that has me feeling some trepidation. Your approach to these things and mine seem to be poles apart. Swami's speaking specifically to the writer of the letter, and by that he means, and he explains but only slightly, she's an academician. And part of what academics do is they study all the alternatives and they comment on all the alternatives. And in that sense, he says, our approaches are poles apart, because that's not how he comes to understand things. I am grateful for yours and believe the Education for Life system needs people like you to make it known and accepted. You asked me about other schools, other writers and educators, other ways of doing things. And of course, you have every reason to expect me to be knowledgeable about these things. This is where he's going. The plain truth is, I am not. I have never even taught children, Swami confesses. My understanding of life comes from experience and from thought and meditation on that experience. This is, Swamiji presumptuously, some might think, but the proof is in the pudding. Swamiji often says, if you can go to the center of yourself, if you can go to the origin point of your own consciousness, then everything can be understood from that point. And the way you said it, my understanding of education for children is from my own experience and from careful meditative consideration of those experiences. And so, now Swami's going to answer her questions. I don't know what the questions are, but the answers are clear. Our schools are fairly new. Swami wrote this in the year 2000. The first school at Ananda Village started in about 1970. The school here in Palo Alto started in the early 90s. And ours was the second school. And so everything came from that. This is now, when Swami was writing in 2000, the school at Ananda Village was 30 years old. The school here in Palo Alto was about 10 years old. I don't know if the schools in Portland and Seattle had begun or not, but they would have been new at that point. So there aren't very many based entirely on the principles that Swami has presented. In 2000, our schools are fairly new. I don't think many people know about them. Those who do, however, have been very well impressed. As for the other traditions you mention, individual teachers in them have loved what we do, but I doubt that we've had much influence on the movements themselves, not because of any lack of interest, but because they are busy doing their thing, and we are busy doing ours. Sometimes people try to collaborate from the start, but Swamiji has always been of the mind you need to get strong in what you're doing so that you have a point of reference when you begin to try to work cooperatively with others. So you have a deep enough understanding of what you yourself are doing that you don't just become diluted and distracted. I don't think, question number 2, answer number 2, I don't think other religious traditions know what they're doing in education. Swami was never shy about expressing his opinion, is he? I don't think they know what they're doing, he says. I've told our own schools, don't limit yourself by being parochial. Therefore, we've named them Living Wisdom Schools rather than Ananda Schools. That change in the name came after we started our school because the school, the lower school, the high school's in a different location, but the lower school shares the same property as our church temple. We have them on different ends of the property, but the property's too small to really separate them. They're really right there. And the school uses our sanctuary as their auditorium because that's the only room we have of that type. And the school also uses the yoga studio, so they're all involved with us. And so we were calling it Ananda School. It was located on the property with the Ananda Temple. And then I would have to tell people that it wasn't parochial. And I told Swami it was a pretty hard sell. Nobody would really believe me. And I said, it isn't parochial. We're not really taking these kids in, at a young age and trying to convert them to become little Anandites. The Catholics actually have a saying, they do it very consciously, give me a child for the first 10 years and we'll have him for the rest of his life. That's actually a saying that they say. And from the beginning, you're educated as a Catholic. And that's what the catechism, the Mass, is perfectly reasonable if that's your objective. But it isn't our objective. Our objective is to connect children with the deepest part of their own reality, which is inherently spiritual. That's just the way it is. Children have, and spiritual in the sense of, I am part of a greater reality. And my happiness comes the more I'm attuned to that greater reality. And that's the basis of all religion. But that is not a religion. And there's no list of dogmas. It's, where does happiness come from? What actions do I take to increase happiness and decrease suffering? So once we began to get going in that way, Swami realized that Ananda was not the right name for the schools. So then he came up with the idea of living wisdom. So there's the Education for Life method, and those schools that are the word I was going to use was sponsored, those schools that are created and operated by Ananda devotees. Doesn't mean exclusively, but they are inspired from Ananda. Our version of Education for Life School is Living Wisdom School. Based on the assumption, which is now, 20 years after this letter was written, Education for Life is really moving around the planet. There's a school in Italy, there's a school in Slovenia, there's interest all over the planet, really. They're working on starting schools in India, and they're all Education for Life schools, and those that are run by Ananda are called Living Wisdom schools, but those that are run by others are called whatever they want to call them, so that the base idea can disseminate very widely. Now, of course, the principles of Sanatana Dharma, which is the eternal religion, that which is reflected in the Education for Life method. But a person, and this is Swami also created it this way, the Living Wisdom schools express every aspect of Education for Life. Many other people just take the pieces that appeal to them, because there's a tremendous amount that's very appealing. So he says, I don't think religious traditions know what they're doing in education. I'll leave it, I'll just let it sit. 3, he says, I think our philosophy of education could be of universal value. The block to their acceptance is not the usefulness of our system, but people's commitment to other ways, and the government's absurd commitment to banishing spiritual principles from the schools in the mistaken belief that spirituality is the same thing as sectarianism. And I mean, just that simple statement. The block to accepting our system is this, that people are committed to other systems, and they don't really consider it with an open mind. They just reject it because it's not what they're doing. And because so many schools are run by government in the U.S., this absurd idea, Swami says, that spiritual principles are sectarian by nature. And then he says, is kindness only a Christian belief or a Muslim one? Is kindness excluded from atheism? It's just, these are the values that we're trying to teach, that which produces happiness. And point number 4, we have not 2, but 5 Living Wisdom schools. Really, we had 5. So the Village, but this was, of course, by 2000. The Village, Palo Alto, Portland, Seattle, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, there was a school in Sacramento, too, at that time, I guess. And hope to start another here in Assisi, Italy. That's where Swami was living at the time. So far, all of them are connected with our communities, but we are trying with some success to give them a separate identity of their own. We'd love to have non-Ananda teachers join our staffs. We'd love to have people of other religions do so. We are not religious. Our focus, to reiterate, is spiritual. Many of the parents of the children in our schools are not Ananda members, and as far as we know, haven't even thought of becoming members. Many of these people, however, are among our school's most ardent supporters. Here in the school that we have in Palo Alto, our community, we've just never had enough children in our community to support a school system. At different times, there's been a higher percentage of having 80-some children, which is what we have now in the lower school. There's, when there are many, let me phrase it differently, many of the Ananda members who have children of the right age would send their children to our school, but they're not community schools, and it's not an Ananda population. It's just a private school in the area, which is very popular with those who are seeking value-based education and spiritual education that's not sectarian. And, number 5. Swami says, I have 175 editions of my various books published in some 23 foreign languages, as well as American editions that sell abroad. He had, he was in 100 countries in 29 languages. and of the 150 books he eventually wrote, this one would be translated into Croatian, and that one into Chinese, and these three, into Russian, and then this one would be in, and it ended up, his books being in 100 countries in 29 languages. Not every title, but the variety. So he says there's 175, mostly foreign language, but also, just foreign language, you would mean, because otherwise the American editions are just shipped overseas. I don't know how many translations there are of Education for Life. Few, I suspect, Swami says. People don't think of me as an educator of children. Therefore, they'll grow interested only in time. Too bad, because to me the education of children is of critical importance. Swamiji said, I'm not the kind of author who becomes popular in his lifetime. The ideas that I'm presenting take time for people to absorb. And then Swami says, but what I am doing, and my Guru Paramhansa Yogananda did, is work with long rhythms that will have an influence on our culture only in decades and perhaps in centuries. I mean, who among us can be thinking like that? Who among us is capable of separating themselves sufficiently from the present moment to grab these universal threads and articulate them without concern for the immediate result, but with great attunement to the long-range influence? I've talked about this repeatedly in this and many of the broadcasts that I do. That Master was an avatar, Swami was one of his main disciples. The work of an avatar just begins with the incarnation of the avatar himself. The work itself just expands out. And that's what Swami's doing. Education for Life is for the future. And it is being noticed in the present, but if you're a student of history at all, you can see how world-changing movements start, are planted, expand, and eventually have their effect. And Swami's very patient with it. He enjoyed an interview with Buckminster Fuller, who was a very innovative thinker. He created many unusual things. He was very broad-based. It was his design that created the geodesic dome. We had many domes up at Ananda Village in the early years. It was his design and many other things. And an interviewer said to him, does it bother you that nobody pays any attention to your work? And he said so cheerfully, sort of like a little child, not at all, he said, not at all. He said, new ideas always take at least a couple of generations to be accepted. He saw the future, and he described the future, and then his description of the future becomes the map for how we're going to get there, both energetically and then sometimes literally. So I was going to say we'll see. I don't know if we'll see it from reincarnating to live it, if we'll see it from the astral world, or if people will just look back and pick up this book and said, look, he knew. Who knows? He says, there it is. Here's the story I just told. Someone asked Buckminster Fuller once, don't you get a little discouraged talking everywhere but seeing so few actual results? He bravely replied, not at all. All new ideas take at least one generation and often two before they begin to take hold. Buckminster Fuller was 85 years old when he gave that answer. And point number 6, and Swami says, you didn't actually give me a 6th question, but I thought I'd add an answer as though you had. Swami's just being very friendly. Yogananda founded a school in Ranchi, India, on which others have been patterned in that country. I don't think many of them are doing much in the direction Yogananda wanted, Swami speaks very frankly, because they made the mistake of inviting government funding. Swamiji has a very strong thought about that, because as soon as you take the government's money, the government tells you what you can and can't do. And the Indian government was just as specific about sectarianism and religion and sectarian, even though Indians ought to be more clear about it. Culturally, they should be. In fact, the government has a very strict policy, had a very strict policy of non-sectarian. And therefore, to a very large extent, the spiritual element of the school was greatly diminished. Swamiji was in a position of influence when the decision was made to accept government money. He argued intensely against it. And what he feared, he said, has exactly happened. I don't know, but that's what he says. So it's called, it's named as Yogananda's school. But Swamiji said it's drifted very far from his ideals. Because the question, which she didn't ask, was what about what Yogananda himself did in India? So that's Swami's answer. Nonetheless, he said, there has been good energy there and in that direction also. I regret to say that I am not current on it. And then Swami says, I very much hope that your conference does all the good in which we both believe, with sincere best wishes. And he signs himself J. Donald Walters, because that's how he was operating with her at that time. Now, the next letters, which carry us through the end of this section, are all about astrology. The second letter is really pretty detailed, so as I said at the beginning, wish me luck. I'm not an astrologer, so this book was put together for the common man, and so we'll see what happens. In 1970, Swami started writing a book called Your Sun Sign as a Spiritual Guide. He became interested in astrology because, in Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, Master actually talks a lot about astrology. There's a whole chapter called Outwitting the Stars and astrology. But what really interested Master Swami was what he read in ancient text and in serious, respected, instruction about the path of meditation and self-realization, that astrology and yoga were actually the same science. Now, since we think of astrology, many people think of astrology as a column in the newspaper, which is superficial at best, Swamiji was exceedingly intrigued by this statement. Now, let's see, how esoteric do I want to be on this? In Swamiji's Raja Yoga course, The Art and Science of Raja Yoga, he talks about the relationship between the chakras, which is the inner energy system, and your horoscope. And each of the chakras is related to a specific planet. And what the principle is that we are born at an exact moment in time into the physical world. We're conceived, of course, and then 9 months later, we emerge from the womb. And at the point that we inhale for the first time, that's the beginning of the incarnation. And the actual birth moment is the first breath. And, if you're going to be serious about your astrological future, it's important to note when that first breath happens and to notice exactly what the time is. Swami makes a reference later in here to that his birth time is given at 7 a.m., but he actually thinks that's not exactly accurate, that the number was rounded to a convenient number, because even a few minutes of time can create a different astrological configuration. The Earth is in constant motion, and everything can shift a little bit. And sometimes the birth time can be calculated from the horoscope, from plotting a few major events in your life, and then seeing how certain planetary patterns would create those events, and then we can work backwards and figure out what the birth time is. Not I can't do it, but it can be done. Okay? So Swamiji became, in his way, extremely interested in understanding enough about astrology to know the truth or falsity of the statement that astrology and yoga were united as a science. In ancient times, they were the same science. So what I was starting to say about Your horoscope, your birth horoscope, is where the Earth was in relation to where the planets were, and this is where I get stuck because I never can quite understand this. Where the planets are, what star constellations were behind them, where the Earth was in relation to that, what was on the horizon line, all these different elements, which are a physical phenomenon. This is a physical universe we're talking about at the moment of your birth. But because there is a relationship that every inner chakra has a corresponding reality in the planets, we choose our moment, or our moment of birth is chosen for us by the magnetic force of the chakras. So we can look at the heavens, at the horoscope, and we're actually looking at the pattern of energy in the chakras. And that's what makes it work. Because there's a karmic pattern that's been set in the chakras, which is the result. The chakras are the energy storehouse of our karma. The chakras are energy centers which hold the vibration of every action, thought, feeling, experience that we have, vibrates with a certain level of consciousness from delusion to enlightenment. And the chakras are the way that that energy stays with us, because we have an ego identification with our own actions. It creates an energy pattern. And the energy pattern in the chakras determines our fate. And when the physical body dies, that energy body separates from the physical body, but it remains completely intact. And the quality of that energy body is what determines our next incarnation. And the acting out of the inevitable momentum of the energy that we've created up until that point is what determines our destiny, our karma, in other words. I mean, now this is a huge science, and I have lots of classes in it. And I encourage you, if you're interested, go to my YouTube channel, type in chakras. The most watched classes that I give are based on the chakras, and I'm always talking about it. Okay, so it's hard to see the chakras, and when it's a little baby is born, it's hard to, the personality hasn't yet manifested in a very coherent way. But if you look at the horoscope, the moment of birth matches the pattern in the chakras. So you read the planetary positions, their relationship to each other, where they are in the zodiac, and all these other esoteric things. Then you know what the destiny, you read at least, let me put it differently. If you have the intuition and the understanding, it's possible to read it. Not everyone who attempts to read it has sufficient depth of understanding to read it accurately. But it's scientific. I mean, what I mean is it's been around for millennia, and it's well developed. It's highly developed, and so the scriptures say yoga and astrology are the same science, because they're the science of human destiny and karma. And there's many remarkable examples of it. So Swami didn't feel that anything he read really presented it in the way that he felt it should be presented, so he decided to write a book. And like education, he didn't write the book by going out and studying what everyone else said and synthesizing it. He did it by meditating on his own experience. And so there's 2 letters here. One of them was written in the year 2000. I'll read it first. And the second one was written at the time that he wrote the book. And it was a long discussion that he was having with a friend of his who was a professional astrologer. And he would ask her questions and discuss what he was doing. If I'm not mistaken, her name was Blanche Whitestar. My expectation is that she's not on the planet now, some 50 years later. But he would discuss his ideas with her. She was fascinated by his perceptions and his insights, because they came from a completely different source, which was his pure intuitive understanding of human nature and yoga. But Swami liked to have her as a sounding board, both to confirm and because she was herself skilled and intuitive enough that there could be a lot of give and take. So first this letter, which was written in the year 2000, many years later. And Swami says, here are a few hasty answers to your questions. As for astrology, I believe it is based on true principles, but is greatly overused and overdepended on. Swami says, I wrote the book, Your Sun Sign as a Spiritual Guide, also to help inspire people to direct a craze more validly. In fact, after nearly 30 years, it is still considered by many people to be a classic in its field, and it is. It's unique, and it's very, very interesting. What I found was that most writers on the subject had gone from assumptions on the sun signs to blanket statements about the people in those signs. However, I simply couldn't relate to what they wrote to the people I knew, what they wrote about the people I knew. So I meditated on people I knew in each sign and tried to intuit qualities they all had in common. I tried to lift the subject to a more spiritual level. I do believe there's truth in the subject because Yogananda's guru was an inspired and infallibly right astrologer. Now we're talking about Sri Yukteswar, who was an avatar, who worked from a knowledge of astrology. So a man on that level of realization, who still referred to and studied and spoke from astrological understanding, gives an extraordinary credibility to the whole concept, which Swami did not see manifested in what he read. So he was trying to discover for himself and then lift the whole study up to a higher level. But I must say, I haven't seen much come out of the predictions that various astrologers over the years have made for me. Still, as a guide to spiritual progress, I think that book has done a lot of good. So Swami's saying again, that he didn't find available to the public the book he thought was needed, so he wrote it. Which is seeing astrology not just as a way to predict whether I'll get money and what job I should take, but to use it for self-study, to understand how to take one's own basic nature and then elevate it to a divine level, because what's the point of living? If self-realization is the goal, every aspect of life can be approached from an angle that will support and enhance that potential in us. So that's what Swami was trying to do. That's why he called it Your Sun Sign as a Spiritual Guide. Just as a fact, there are two systems of astrology, Western and Eastern. They talk about it. And the Western, which is nowadays the Vedic astrology, which is the Eastern side, versus whatever they call the Western side, there's much more of a crossover. And what I mean to say, there's many more Vedic astrologers in the West than there was in 1970. In the Western system, the sun sign is given much more emphasis, much more importance than it is in the Vedic side. But Swami decided to write the book for Westerners from the Western perspective based on, are you a Leo, are you a Cancer, which is where just simply the month, the time of the year in which you were born. Swami then also wrote, I wrote How to Be a Channel, which is a different book completely, to correct the channeling craze. I'm not all in favor of mediumship. I wrote the book to try to get people to channel God and truth. It's a different subject. His little book, How to Be a Channel, How to Be a True Channel, the title was changed, is an absolutely marvelous classic book. At the time he wrote it, a lot of people were going into trances and channeling disincarnate entities, and Swami became quite alarmed by it and decided he would talk about what it really means to be a channel for truth and for wisdom. But he just threw that in there. Okay, now we're going to go to the bigger letter. And this is we'll only just get started. To a professional astrologer discussing Swamiji's book, Your Sun Sign as a Spiritual Guide, March 18, 1971. I actually arrived, I met Swami in 69, the very end of the year. I arrived at Ananda Village on June 1st of 1971. And Swami was just finishing the book when I got there. And as I said, I believe he wrote this to Blanche White Star, but I'm not quite sure because I hadn't arrived yet. So here Swami says, the Sun Sign book, which I thought I would toss off quickly in a week, is still not completed. I have only finished Leo, I suppose he started wherever he started, Aries probably. I've only finished Leo and am evolving ideas as I go along that will necessitate my rewriting Aries and Taurus to some extent. So he started with Aries. So of the 12 signs of the zodiac, he's only finished 3 of them, and 2 of them are going to have to be rewritten. Specifically, I am universalizing each sign by addressing myself not only to Geminis, Leos, etc., but also to the Gemini, Leo, etc. in all of us. Because, of course, we all manifest these various traits to some extent. One of the fascinating things about the signs is how they pinpoint basic, universal characteristics in man. There's a funny thing in the introduction to the book. Swami, somewhere he says, I have dedicated this book to that rare individual reader who will read the book from start to finish instead of looking immediately for their own sun sign and reading nothing else. And the reason he wants you to do that is because these are all aspects of all of our nature. And even if we have an orientation or a predominance of one quality, what's going to be expressed is a well-rounded human being, and we can all learn from all of them. So that's what he was saying right at the beginning. One thing I am realizing is that the reason I have felt subconsciously impelled to work on these signs is that it helps me to understand different types of people better and to see that a piece of advice which might be good for one person would be confusing and unhelpful to another. In line with this thought, I am giving different kinds of spiritual advice under each sign, even with techniques of meditation. It is turning into a book of spiritual counsel. So, Swamiji, well, he's always learning himself. He says if writing a book is not a growing experience from the author, then for the author, he says, as an author, if writing a book is not a growing experience for himself, then he needs to work harder and go deeper. He actually, after he finished this book, I think it was afterwards, but maybe he went back and he had written what is now The Art and Science of Raja Yoga, which is it's all in one volume, but it's a course of 14 lessons. He had written it earlier. It had an earlier iteration when he was teaching a lot and raising money and trying to get Ananda started, and he would send it out every week or 2, and he would rush to finish it to get it out in time. I think it went out every 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. But he said it was very popular and people liked it, but he said he was never satisfied with it. And he said because it was not a growing experience for him. In other words, he just wrote it from what he already knew. He didn't really create it as an original work. He just didn't have time to do it. So he went back and rewrote the whole thing much more slowly. And he said, and he always tried to find something, some new understanding that he could share with us. Not twisting the truth, but just so that it would be a real fresh. And he said sometimes he would have to stop writing for a week or even several weeks while he, as he said, meditated more deeply on the subject at hand until he could come to an answer. So that's what also started happening writing this book. As he really tried to get deeper into it, he began to see a reality that he hadn't seen before. He goes on to say, I am trying to stay away from the idea of types. People have all these traits. Some manifest more of certain traits than of others, but essentially we are none of these traits. We are ever perfect souls. So how can you say that you're this type or that type? Because it's a falseness. And he didn't want to reinforce our delusion. He wanted to free us from all delusion. I think that what I have found most unsatisfactory in astrology books I have read, especially with regard to the sun signs, is the impression I get that the writers are thinking so much in terms of this type and that type of person that they forget to think of people as people. You know, it's like they try to make man fit the Sabbath, and rather than realizing that it's that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You know, we can't sort of make a person into a Leo. We have to see who the person is and then try to understand how their being born under that sign influences their character. The result is that most books don't go deeply enough into human nature. All they do is skate about on the surface. One does not get an impression of a human being as seen from within. Very interesting comment. And yes, after all, I may realize when I've got it all done that I am only being presumptuous to think I can contribute anything valid in a field to which so many people have devoted their lives. So, because, you know, astrologers are often extremely erudite in their subject. They often spend decades and decades honing their craft. And Swami recognizes he's just sailing in with no background and no context and presuming to make pronouncements that nobody else has ever thought of. And he admits that maybe this is a presumption, and he's respectful that it might be. However, yet, I have the strong impression that when I take up any subject, I have only to put my mind on it deeply enough in meditation, and all sorts of new and valid answers come. I find that this is the way, more than by a lot of fact gathering, that I arrive at understanding. This is what he was always telling us. You know, if we become in tune with our point of origin, we become in tune with the source of all understanding. And understanding that grows from inner attunement is more powerful and more original because it's related to our point of origin than that which is merely accumulated from the outside. I believe that a mere handful of facts, meditated on deeply, will supply one with far greater insights than thousands of facts, with no time left after gathering them to meditate on their significance. Even one fact, deeply enough understood, will often suffice to explain thousands of other facts. And this is the way Swami lived, and this is part of the secret of his extraordinary intelligence and understanding, was that he could take any aspect of reality and go into the infinite through that. Eternity in a blade of grass, in a grain of sand. You know, if we can understand the smallest aspect of creation, it opens us up to the divine. Swami manifested this countless times in his life. This was just the beginning. With this thought in mind, I wanted to write to you, not only to report on my progress with the book, but to ask your thoughts on some ideas that have been coming to me. I've been puzzling, so now he's beginning his questions. I've been puzzling over the meaning of one's rising sign. I know it is supposed to govern one's physical appearance, at least to some extent, and to indicate the way we present ourselves to the world, or the way that others see us. I've always had 3 objections to these explanations. 1, they are all superficial considerations, the way you look, yet the rising sign is so important that it alone determines the placement of all houses and therefore the departments of our lives in relation to the positions of the planets. Number 2, the way others see us is entirely a matter of what they are looking for or what they are prepared to see. Some will see more our sun characteristics, others more our moon, etc. This is therefore entirely too vague an explanation to be of any use at all. And of course what he's saying is, people's perception of you is more often an indication of their reality than your own. And so how can other people's delusion be the definition of your nature? So he sees it's confusing. Number 3, the way we present ourselves to the world is not only vague, but also suggests something I don't believe, that we always present ourselves before others with a mask over our faces. Certainly, one of the main ways we present ourselves to the world is through our sun sign, which more often than not are very different from our rising signs. And that is why the explanation also is vague. We present ourselves in different ways for different purposes. To say that our rising sign indicates the way in which we present ourselves doesn't give us a strong enough handle to enable us to carry any weight. It is not useful. There it is. It is not useful. And of course, it is mildly insulting. We are not all that duplicitous. So there he says that. For those reasons, I've never been able to include the rising sign seriously in my thinking. Yet I've known it must be important. So last night I meditate on it, specifically with regard to myself and to 2 or 3 other people whose rising signs I know. You see what I mean about a paucity of facts? I know very few people's rising signs, but here is what came to me. So Swamiji both stands forth with great confidence in his unorthodox methods and then anticipates all the criticisms that will be given and completely acknowledges that they're valid. I just want to sort of spend a minute on the ease with which Swami is willing to just, open himself. On one hand, this is my experiment. These are my conclusions. Obviously, he has enough confidence in what he's doing, both to do it and then to lay it in front of his friend. But he also, just perfectly humbly and with a touch of humor, says it would be easy to criticize my method, but well, here it is. And this is also, he's just very at ease with himself. He's exactly what he's saying. I'm not duplicitous. I'm just presenting to you who I am. So now Swami says, my own rising sign is Gemini. Then parenthetically, it has to be, even though the official time of my birth, 7 a.m., puts it at 2 minutes, 19 degrees Cancer, he says. He just puts that parenthetically. Swami adjusted his own birth time based on his self-knowledge, that it just has to be. That doesn't make any sense for it to be that. It has to be this. Very few people see me as a Gemini, yet in my own mind, Gemini suggests very aptly my way of handling problems, sort of sending them shooting up into the air, refusing to be tied down to traditional answers and solutions. Gemini indicates the way I perceive things, analyzing them with a view to finding new angles of approach. I'm interested in many things, but always from a standpoint of the ideas they provide me with, not for the things themselves. I have a capacity for sustaining numerous unrelated interests at one time, and to enter with enthusiasm into each one of them as soon as I put my mind to it. So he's talking about all his Gemini rising characteristics. Gemini suggests not only the face I show to the world, perhaps it does that, but rather the way I face the world from inside my own mind. Isn't that interesting? Instead of saying how other people see me, it's how I relate to the world, how I face the world. Even that definition won't suffice, because I can face the world with several intentions. If, in seeking to exert my authority over others, I am also facing the world, I am not yet acting through my sun sign. So a closer word would be the way I perceive the world. Yet even this is not enough. I perceive it also through my inner attitudes, which are suggested by my moon sign. What is the rising sign? It determines the placement of my houses or life departments. This means that it's in my 9th house, my house of religion, that I receive Jupiter's rays. In my 10th house, I receive the combined rays of Mars and Uranus in my solar horoscope, Venus in my sidereal, which is my Eastern Vedic chart. Receiving, surely, is the key word. How we receive our impressions of the world, including the challenges and problems which it presents. The definition includes the way we face or perceive the world from a standpoint purely of receptive consciousness. So that's where he's sort of trying to find a new way even of discussing the rising sign. This definition doesn't contradict the more common ones, for the way we receive our impressions discerns also our immediate superficial reactions to them. Yet it doesn't limit the influence of the rising sign to these superficial reactions. So this is how Swami just starts with what he starts with. He goes with his experience. He tries to reconcile how it all comes together. If an impression or a situation or anything external is important enough for us to want to react to it by impressing our authority outward in return, we take it deep inside first. You know, if something is really important, we take it deep inside, gather our forces, and then come out with a reaction that is very different usually from the quick, superficial reaction that was only a sign of the way we had received the impression, the news, the remark, the challenge, or whatever. This deeper reaction will, of course, follow the influence of our sun sign. There it all stands. As I think of it, I see that there has to be this receptivity provided for in the chart to counterbalance the externalizing flow of the sun sign. The moon, though receptive, doesn't quite tell the whole story, since it indicates our subjective reaction. So here again, Swami's just applying his, Swamiji doesn't hesitate to use common sense. He's never been intimidated by what other people think, what other people say, what the tradition is. Back when we were talking about education for life, Swami says the greatest obstacle to the acceptance of the ideas he's presenting are not the ideas himself, but the fact that people are already committed to something else. And among the many characteristics of Swami is he's always willing, just as he describes it himself, he describes it as a Gemini way, to just shoot ideas out into the universe and just see what might be true. He doesn't have to follow along narrow lines. So there's been this tradition about what the rising sign means all this time, but with common sense, Swami is saying, but there's flaws in that. It just doesn't satisfy. So he's proposing, to this woman who's devoted her whole life to this study, for whom it's more than just the Swami's just walked into it right now. What about all these ideas? Are these ideas going to work? And he presents them, of course, with full commitment, with a complete explanation, for how he came to it, why he thinks it, what the flaws are, what it might mean, to see what response he'll get. In fact, the moon seems to play a dual role. It indicates not only the attitude with which we view the subject of authority, or let me say rather the personal attitude with which we review it, but also the personal attitude that we bring to bear on the impressions we receive. In other words, I not only receive my impressions of the world through a filter of ideas and creative questions, my personal attitude toward these ideas is distinctly leonine, my moon being, as you know, in Leo. What they mean to me, the special interest they hold for me, is how I can use them to spread enlightenment to other people. The way in which I externalize myself, impress my authority, is Turian, in its persistence, etc. But my personal attitude, again, indicates the special interest this work holds for me, which is leonine, the wish to share, to enlighten. So he just is going through, and I don't know enough to really make intelligent comments about it, so I'm just putting it out there for you to see how he's thinking it through. So we see that the moon is the pivotal point between the rising sign and the sun sign. Our personal attitude lends the color of special meaning that we give to the impressions we receive, to our perceptions of the world around us. Our personal attitude, again, determines the way we, in turn, seek to impress ourselves on the world. So I'm going to stop there, which is about, actually we don't have that much more of this letter to go, but it's more than I can do. So it's a long discussion of the sun signs. We have another page before we finish it, and I hope you find it interesting. God bless you, my friends.